I said a 2-inch margin, not 2.2. Did you even listen to the morning brief, or did you just show up to collect a paycheck? Old man, Lieutenant Carter's voice cut through the gear-filled room like a blade. Walter Briggs set his coffee thermos down, his hand still resting on the edge of the parachute line, as if he only chose to hear the things that truly mattered. But Carter wasn't finished. His tone sharpened with contempt. How does a relic from the Cold War even get in here? This is a SEAL unit, not a retirement home. No one in the room dared breathe too loudly. The younger riggers exchanged uneasy glances, fully aware the lieutenant had crossed a line. Walter simply replied with one quiet sentence, soft as a passing breeze. I hear everything I need to. That calmness only fueled Carter's anger. He stepped closer, voice dripping with mockery. What's that on your neck? Some cheap tattoo you got while drunk on Liberty back in the Stone Age? Walter slowly lifted his hand to the faded patch of ink. The entire room fell into a heavy silence so dense it felt like the air itself had thickened. And then from a distance came the steady rumble of military engines growing clearer and closer, pulling every gaze toward the doorway. No one knew what was coming, only that something had shifted quietly, deeply, and far beyond anything Carter had imagined. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories so we can preserve the memories, dignity, and honor of our quiet heroes. Walter Briggs stood silently at the packing table, his aging hand pausing just above a thin white line fragile as a thread pulled straight from memory. A simple motion, one he had done thousands of times. Yet in that moment, everything around him seemed to slow. The awkward laughter, the shuffling steps of the younger riggers, the faint clinks of metal tools, each sound slipped away, leaving only the steady breath of Walter, deep, heavy, and worn, like the life he had carried across so many battlefields. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from a memory that rose without warning. When his fingertips touched the parachute cord, an image flickered through his mind, like an old reel restarting itself. A cramped torpedo room, cold metal pressed against his back, the smell of machine oil thick in the air, the steady hum of a submarine's engines. A dim yellow bulb barely lighting the faces of young men in damp diving gear, their eyes burning with a resolve no one on earth could teach. Walter saw his own hands again, unlined, lean, marked with the small cuts of youth. In them was a homemade tattoo needle carved from a guitar string. The ink was a makeshift mixture of ash and pen ink, stirred in a battered metal lid. Across from him sat his teammate, Marcus Hale, bowing his head to reveal the side of his neck. They tattooed each other with a small, crooked symbol, not pretty, not perfect, but full of soul, a rough, simple trident. Not for show, not for rank. It was the mark of a promise they were about to step into an operation no one had ever attempted. They were too young to grasp the scale of their own recklessness, yet old enough to understand that survival was a luxury none of them could count on. In the middle of that memory, Walter heard Marcus's voice, low, steady, slipping through the metal air like a soft draft. We go together. Few words, but heavy as the ocean that surrounded them. It was not a motto, not a command. It was a vow that had anchored itself in Walter's heart for more than 50 years. He opened his eyes. The room returned to its present form. Parachute lines stretched out in long rows, bright orange under the overhead lights. A few young riggers pretended to stay busy, trying not to meet Lieutenant Carter's gaze. None of them understood why Walter's hand had paused for so long. None of them understood where that faded ink had been carved under what fear and beside which men. Walter lifted his hand off the line and drew in a controlled breath. Though he said nothing, every exhalation was enough for the perceptive few to sense that the silence of an old man was never weakness. It was a mountain sharpened by time, the cooled ash of things he had done lost and carried for an entire lifetime. Young men saw only an old worker standing still over a parachute. They did not see the shifting layers of memory behind his eyes, things they would never experience, and perhaps never have the strength to endure. Walter gently straightened the line in front of him. His calm was not an attempt to hide anything, but the way he held on to his dignity. No reaction, no anger, no retaliation. Only the quiet, steady presence of someone who had survived storms that younger generations would only ever read about in books or classified reports. Then he heard his own breathing, again steady, familiar. The breathing of a man who had fallen from altitudes cold enough to cut skin, who had held his breath in dark water, who had lived through moments where a half-second mistake would mean no one lived to tell the story. For Walter, silence was not emptiness. It was a home, a place he always returned to. He opened his eyes fully and pressed his palm lightly against the table. Reality settled back into place. The cord, The chute, the room, the uneasy glances, all of it realigning itself. Walter adjusted his collar to cover the faded tattoo, not out of shame, but because he knew some things needed no display to be real. And just as his fingers touched his ID badge, Lieutenant Carter's voice cut through the air again, sharper, harsher, as if determined to tear apart the fragile quiet Walter had just reclaimed. Lieutenant Carter suddenly raised his voice, the sharp edge of it slicing through the calm Walter had been holding on to. He snatched the logbook from the edge of the table, flipping through the pages with open contempt. Each turn punctuated by words that cut straight into the dignity of the old man standing before him. All of these entries will be reviewed. If I find even the smallest mistake, even half an inch off, I'll have you removed from this base and your access revoked. You won't set foot in here for another day. Is that clear? Walter didn't answer. He simply stood there, shoulders straight, hands resting by his sides, as if holding something deeper than any argument could touch. The younger men in the room bowed their heads, forcing themselves to focus on their tasks, avoiding the lieutenant's glare. Everyone knew parachute packing was one of the most sensitive duties in the SEAL community. There was no room for arrogance or disrespect. But Carter kept going louder, harsher, as if Walter's silence was provoking the deepest irritation he had ever felt. Not satisfied with his words, Carter snapped his wrist and shoved the logbook toward the edge of the table, knocking over Walter's coffee thermos. A stream of hot coffee spilled out, rushing dangerously close to the half-open parachute. One single drop on that fabric could ruin a mission. In a split second, Walter moved with a speed that didn't match his age. He pulled the chute toward himself, and with his other hand caught the thermos before the liquid could touch the bright orange material. The motion was so precise that those watching needed a few seconds to understand what had just happened. But when Walter bent down to secure the chute, his collar dipped enough to reveal the faded ink beneath his skin, the mark he had carried for half a lifetime. A rough trident, unpolished, imperfect but alive with survival and sacrifice. Carter saw it, and instead of grasping its weight, he let out a short, cruel laugh. Oh, so that's what it is. A prison tattoo. Or something you got drunk during Liberty back in the day. Drunk Liberty night, right? The entire room shifted in that instant. No one dared move. The younger riggers stared at the ink on Walter's neck, not out of curiosity, but because they sensed Carter had stepped into something dangerously wrong. Walter remained still, but his memories did not. They burst open like a steel hatch thrown wide into the night. A dark torpedo room, dim light reflecting off young faces trembling more from cold than fear. The smell of metal, the taste of the sea, the steady churn of machinery. And Marcus, the brother? He never forgot holding the makeshift tattoo needle wrapped from a guitar string, the ink mixed from ash and pen dye. Their eyes met in the narrow space between life and death. We go together, Marcus said, his voice deep and steady, like an anchor dropped into the ocean floor. All of them tattooed the same symbol onto their necks. Not to boast, not to intimidate, but to remember that they had stepped into the dark together. Then the ache of memory faded, and the present returned. Walter straightened, lowering his hands with calm control. He didn't look at Carter, didn't strike back, didn't justify himself. The silence he created stood like a thick wall no one dared touch. It made Carter falter only for a few seconds before he covered it with another forced smirk. But the others didn't miss it. They watched Walter as if something vast had begun to rise from the depths of his silence. And just as Carter opened his mouth to launch another attack, a different sound from beyond the doorway froze the entire room, stretching the air tight like an invisible cord. Senior Chief Rowan stood in the corner of the room, his hand still gripping the rigging tools, but his eyes locked on the side of Walter Briggs's neck. Not everyone could recognize that kind of ink, but Rowan could. He had seen it only once in his life back when he was still a brand new recruit. A crude trident tattoo unlike anything modern SEALs wore. It belonged to the old generation, the men who carved the path for the entire force that followed. The kind of men he had been told to lower his head for when they walked past. Rowan understood instantly what the rest of the room was missing. Lieutenant Carter had stepped onto sacred ground he had absolutely no experience to comprehend. That tattoo wasn't just a symbol. It was a story, a piece of bone, a mark belonging to souls who never came home. Without saying a word, Rowan set his tools down and walked across the chaotic workspace past Carter, who still stood there, face flushed red, hand inches away from ripping the ID badge off Walter's chest. Rowan slipped into the small office at the back, closed the door, and pulled out his personal phone. He didn't call security. He didn't call a department head. He dialed directly to the base commander's office, Captain Mark Ellison. When the line picked up, Rowan spoke only one sentence. No explanation, no elaboration. "Sir, It's about Mr. Briggs and his neck tattoo. The silence that followed said more than any explanation could. On the other end of the line, inside a secure briefing room where senior officers were discussing fleet operations, Captain Ellison shot to his feet. His aide beside him didn't even have time to ask what was wrong before Ellison snapped the folder shut. He didn't justify it. He only left behind a single sentence that froze the entire room. I have to go. Now. Ellison strode into the corridor and said to his aide, "Get the vehicle ready and call Fleet Master Chief Danner to the front gate." Immediately. No one questioned why a tattoo could trigger a reaction from the commander of the entire base, urgent as an incoming red alert. But those who had served long enough understood that certain names, certain symbols, certain vows belonged to a realm no one dared take lightly. Meanwhile, back in the rigging bay, Lieutenant Carter was closing in on Walter only a few steps away from grabbing the elder man's ID badge. His voice was still loud and full of shallow authority. "Give it here. You're officially off this assignment. I'll escort you to the gate myself." Walter didn't move. He stood as still as stone, broad shoulders relaxed, as if he had heard this kind of threat decades ago and survived worse. The young riggers around them clenched their fists in tension, but dared not intervene. Carter was an officer. Walter was just an old contractor, and none of them realized they were seconds away from witnessing a moment when the invisible history of a legendary unit was about to walk into the room in the form of a man who had already been through hell. Then the sound arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, just sharp enough to seize every throat in the room, the abrupt screech of military tires stopping just outside the bay. The scrape of rubber dragging across pavement. The atmosphere shifted. The men closest to the door instinctively turned their heads. Carter's hand, stretched toward Walter's badge, froze midair, suspended, as if his entire body suddenly understood that something monumental was about to descend on him. The steel door swung open. A wave of cold air swept through as the silhouettes of two men stepped into the rigging area. They needed no introduction, no words. Their reputation always arrived before they did. Captain Mark Ellison and Fleet Master Chief Danner, a pair. Known throughout the special operations community, and known for one thing, they only appeared together when something exceedingly serious was at stake. And when the two of them walked straight toward Walter, without sparing Carter even a single glance, the entire room seemed to understand what only Carter realized last. Captain Mark Ellison entered the supply bay like a cold wind, cutting straight from the hallway into the center of the room. He didn't slow down. He didn't waver. Every pair of eyes followed his stride, but the man he was looking for wasn't the lieutenant standing frozen at the front. Ellison walked straight ahead, neither glancing left nor right, ignoring Carter's parted lips, ready to explain, ready to say he was just doing his job. It was as if Carter no longer existed in that room. When Ellison stopped in front of Walter Briggs, he stood at full attention. A dense, heavy silence settled over the parachute bay. Everyone waited to see what would happen, and what they saw felt as though the entire room had frozen in place. Ellison raised his right hand, the firm hand of a man who had served half his life in the United States Navy. His salute was sharp, flawless, so precise that even those who had never worn a uniform could feel the solemn weight of it. Then Ellison spoke, his voice carrying a gravity that allowed no doubt Master Chief Briggs, "It's an honor to have you here." No one in the room could breathe. They had all heard every word clearly. Master Chief, the highest enlisted rank a sailor could achieve. A man who wasn't an officer yet carried more weight than most officers they had ever met. A man the base commander himself had to salute first. Fleet Master Chief Danner stood just behind Ellison. He watched for only a few seconds before standing at attention as well and offering his own salute. For those who had ever worn the uniform, this wasn't just a gesture. It was recognition. It was respect paid to a lifetime of sacrifice only they could truly understand. The silence in the bay grew so complete that someone swallowing could be heard across the room. Young riggers, new recruits, and even those who had once dismissed Walter as just an old part-time worker stood unmoving, eyes wide, at a moment they knew they might never witness again. They understood now they were standing before a legend, and they realized how profoundly they had misunderstood the man in front of them. As for Lieutenant Carter, every trace of color drained from his face as if someone had pulled the life straight out of him. His arms hung limp at his sides. When Ellison first entered the bay, Carter had tried to piece together a smile, tried to prepare a defense. But now no sound escaped his throat. He could only stand there staring at the man he had mocked, now being greeted as one of the founding pillars of the Navy's most elite special operations force. Walter Briggs remained exactly where he had been. He didn't show pride. He didn't bask in the moment. His eyes only flickered once at the sound of Master Chief, as if decades of service tugged gently on a corner of his heart. But he didn't return the salute. Not out of arrogance, but because he no longer lived as a Master Chief. He lived as a quiet worker doing the job he believed was right. Ellison lowered his hand, though his gaze stayed level with Walter's. A long moment passed before anyone dared breathe. Then Walter finally spoke low and steady, as if reminding them that he had never needed fanfare. "I'm just doing my part, sir." Ellison nodded once. "You've been doing your part your entire life, Master Chief." The young men in the bay felt as if they were waking from a trance, the pieces they hadn't understood all morning. Walter's silence, his quick reflexes, the faded ink on his neck, suddenly fell into place. Everything led to this moment. A moment that showed respect didn't come from age or job titles. It came from the life a person had lived. One by one, they bowed their heads, not because they were ordered to, not because they were afraid, but because they recognized they were standing in the presence of something far greater than the rank on their sleeves. And when Captain Ellison turned to face everyone present, ready to reveal the truth they were about to confront, the atmosphere shifted once more. Not shock now, but a deep, quiet expectation for what would be unveiled next. Captain Mark Ellison stood before the entire parachute bay, his shoulders squared, his gaze sharp as winter wind. No one spoke. No one dared move. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice rose slowly, but with an authority that felt like he was reciting a chapter of history most people in the room had never heard. "Many of you may not know this," he began, "but Mr. Walter Briggs is not just an ordinary rigger. He is a first-generation Master Chief of SEAL Team 6. A few murmurs rippled through the room, then died instantly under the weight of his words. Some of the younger sailors exchanged stunned glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Others straightened their posture, realizing they were standing before a man whose story existed only in classified reports and quiet, half-forgotten whispers. Ellison continued, his voice deepening with each sentence. He was one of the pioneers of halo jumps, back when no one knew if the human body could even survive at that altitude. He was selected for Operation Eagle Claw at a time when most of us weren't old enough to understand the price paid by that mission. He paused, giving the room a moment to absorb every word. Then he spoke each medal clearly, as if engraving them into the air. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. 5 bronze stars for valor. Each award landed like a hammer on concrete. The people standing before Walter suddenly felt as if decades had stretched between themselves and the man they had underestimated. Ellison locked his eyes directly onto Carter as he spoke the next line. "The tattoo on Mr. Briggs's neck, the one some have called a jailhouse tattoo, is a plank owner's trident, a symbol given to the men who built SEAL Team 6 from the ground up. It was carved with blood, with ash, with a vow, and with a price only those who've walked through darkness can understand." Carter lowered his head, his face drained of all color. The statement wasn't just truth, it was an indictment of his arrogance. The bay was filled with different faces, but all now shared the same expression: astonishment, respect, and a quiet shame as they remembered how they had looked at Walter just minutes earlier. Ellison turned back toward Walter, his voice softening into something almost reverent, as though carrying the weight of the souls who never returned. "Mr. Briggs doesn't do this job for a paycheck. He does it because of a promise to the men who didn't come back from that mission. He perfects every shoot, every line, as if each one is a chance to give life back to the men who will jump next." Walter didn't move, but his eyes shifted ever so slightly, as though familiar names were rising out of the depths of his memory. Marcus Dan Lewis, men who stepped into darkness and never saw the light again. Everyone in the bay now looked at him with new eyes. They saw an old man standing in the middle of the room, but they also saw the young warrior he once was, charging into places the rest of the world would never dare to step. They saw a quiet worker folding parachutes, but they also saw someone who had folded his own life countless times so others might survive. The atmosphere in the bay was the exact opposite of Carter's earlier arrogance. Where there had been shouting and disrespect, there was now reverence, true reverence, and a silence that only soldiers understand. The silence of people who have finally grasped something far bigger than themselves. Ellison delivered his final line, like a conclusion. Walter had never needed to hear, but always deserved. "We don't just pack parachutes in here. We protect the lives of those who follow. And Mr. Briggs was one of the first who taught our generation that truth." And in that silence, as the weight of those words settled, a small movement from Carter signaled that the next lesson would no longer come from the commander, but from the only man who truly had the right to speak next. After Captain Ellison delivered his final words, The entire bay fell into a silence that draped itself over the room like a heavy cloth. It was in that stillness that Lieutenant Carter froze, his shoulders trembling slightly, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He drew in a deep breath, then bowed his head before everyone present, his voice cracking. "Sir, I take full responsibility. I behaved completely out of line." The words slipped from his mouth with difficulty, as if they weighed more than the uniform on his body. Captain Ellison looked at Carter, his eyes holding both disappointment and the stern duty of a leader who had seen far too many young officers misunderstand what honor truly meant. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his tone low but sharp as a well-honed blade, "you are not fit to lead sailors. A man who knows only how to give orders but not how to respect those who came before him cannot safeguard the life of anyone." Carter lowered his head even further, unable to look at anyone, not even Walter. If he could choose, he might have wished to go back to being 16, teaching himself humility before arrogance ever had the chance to grow roots. But the person who broke the heavy moment was the one no one expected, Walter Briggs. He stood still for a few seconds, then spoke quietly, his voice steady and deep, the same voice he had carried through years of service. "He's young. His fire just needs direction." The sentence loosened something in the room, yet tightened something else in the hearts of everyone watching. No one expected Walter to defend Carter. And Walter wasn't defending him. He was simply being who he was, calm, modest, and never willing to crush someone just because they made a mistake. A memory swept through his mind. Marcus Hale, sitting in that dark torpedo room long ago, holding a makeshift tattoo needle, his voice gentle but firm, like stone at the bottom of the sea. "We come back together." Back then, they were just boys who believed they could stand against the world. But Marcus's words had never been about combat. They were a promise that even when one of them faltered, they would pull each other back up. Even when one was weak, the others would not turn away. Walter looked at Carter, truly looked at him for the first time, not as someone who had insulted him, but as a young sailor standing in the wrong place. He continued, slow and deliberate, every word carrying weight. "All of us were clumsy when we first started. Honor doesn't come from your rank or your years in uniform. It comes from how you face your mistakes." Carter lifted his head slightly, eyes red, but refusing to let the tears fall. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He simply spoke the truth of a life that had walked through places Carter couldn't even imagine. "We lost many men. Too many. And every time a young sailor messes up, I think, if someone had taught him at the right moment, maybe someone else wouldn't have had to come home in a flag-draped coffin." The room remained completely still, but the silence was full of understanding. No one wanted to interrupt. No one dared break the depth of the moment. Walter continued, his tone steady, as if speaking a truth that had lived inside him for decades. "What matters isn't avoiding every mistake. What matters is what you learn from it, and who you become because of it." Carter swallowed hard, then whispered, I want to be better, sir." Walter nodded once. "Then start today, not to make it up to me, but to be worthy of the uniform you wear." The young sailors around them released a breath they didn't know they had been holding. They looked at Walter as though he were an old teacher, one who carried stories everyone needed to hear so they wouldn't lose their way. And in that moment, as Carter stood still trying to find his footing again, the fate of both the young officer and the entire rigging bay was about to be shaped by what would happen next, where the legacy of an old warrior would leave its final, lasting mark. In the days following the incident in the parachute bay, the decision regarding Lieutenant Carter came swiftly and without hesitation. He was reassigned to a remote logistics unit in the far north, a place young officers quietly referred to as a career graveyard. A reprimand letter was inserted into his file, the dry red ink marking the end of the arrogance he had carried with him onto the base. It wasn't meant to punish him, but to remind him that disrespect toward those who came before always carries real consequences. But before leaving the base, Carter was required to attend a newly established program created just days after Captain Ellison left the bay. It was a training course called Honor the Foundation, focused on veteran history, the meaning of service, and the responsibility every officer carries when joining a special operations unit. Carter sat silently throughout the session, reading for the first time the names he had only vaguely known. For the first time, he understood that behind every parachute he had treated like a mere object was the life of a father, a brother, a teammate. And for the first time, he realized how close his ignorance had brought him to a mistake that could never be undone if Walter hadn't been Walter. A few weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, Carter walked into a small cafe near the base. Not by chance. He came because he knew Walter Briggs always sat at the corner table by the window where he read the newspaper and drank his black coffee. When he saw Walter Carter paused for several seconds, as if gathering every last bit of courage he had left. He drew in a breath and said, "Sir, I wanted to apologize for everything I did." His voice no longer carried defensiveness or forced politeness. It was the voice of a young man who had finally recognized the emptiness inside himself. Walter looked up, his eyes gentle and steady as always. He gave a small nod and said, "Sit down, son." Carter lowered himself into the seat, gripping his coffee cup, as if afraid it might fall from his hands. Walter watched him quietly, then spoke again, his voice low and warm, like water poured from the long passage of time. "You're not a bad man. You just need to understand that service isn't about expanding a list of orders. Service is putting others before yourself. It's knowing who built the road you're walking on. It's learning humility so you don't do something you'll regret later." Carter sat frozen. "I'll try not to repeat it," he finally said. Walter nodded again. "Not try. Live that way. Every day." The conversation was quiet but filled with transformation. When Carter rose to leave the cafe, he didn't just bow his head to thank Walter. He bowed to a piece of history he had once blindly trampled. As for Walter, once Carter left, he folded his newspaper, placed money on the table, and rose with the familiar steps of a man who had followed the same rhythm for years. He returned to the parachute bay as he did every morning. No one said a word as he walked in. They simply watched him with a respect words couldn't capture. Walter placed his hand on a newly packed chute hands that had saved countless lives. The faint trident ink on his neck peeked from beneath his collar, not showy, not needing recognition, but present as a promise that had never faded. In that moment, people didn't just see an old worker doing his job. They saw a living legacy, a quiet piece of history, still protecting the generation that came after. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story made you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.